All right, good morning. I'd like to introduce Mr. Peter Zeihan, a strategist, a thinker, a futurist, and he's our speaker today. He's an expert in geopolitics, the study of how place impacts the financial, economic, cultural, political, and military developments. He presents customized executive briefings to a wide array of audiences to include, and not limited to, financial professionals, Fortune 500 firms, energy investors, and a mix of industrial power, agriculture, and consulting associations and corporations. Mr. Zeihan has been featured in and cited by numerous newspapers and broadcasts, including the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, AP, Bloomberg, CNN, ABC, the New York Times, Fox News, and MarketWatch. Peter is a critically acclaimed author whose first three books, The Accidental Superpower, The Absent Superpower, and Disunited Nations, have been recommended by Mitt Romney, Fareed Zakaria, and Ian Bremmer. Peter is also a highly sought after public speaker with a keen eye towards what will drive tomorrow's headlines. His irreverent approach transforms topics that are normally dense and heavy into accessible, relevant takeaways for audiences of all types. And with that, welcome, Peter.
Hello, everyone. I'm coming to you from, where am I? Atlanta today. Everyone has decided, I guess, that COVID is over, so everyone wants to get together, which means I'm on the road again. Anyway, while we're doing this, if you've got any questions, just feel free to interrupt me. We've got plenty of time, I hope. And if there's anything that I cannot answer, I'll jot down your contact information. I'll get back to you. It's a lot to hold in one person's head, and I've got a great team. But of course, we need to start with the war. All right, so on the right, we've got a population density map. And the lighter color of orange is, oh, sorry, it's on its side. So if you have to turn your head, this is the life of an author. You have to match the page rather than reality. So north is to your right. The lighter color of the orange on the right map is a population density that is about the same as Nebraska if you melon scoop out Lincoln and Omaha. So you will have neighbors, but you will not see them every day. The map on the left is a combination climate and economic map. So the green in the left, which overlaps the orange on the right, that's the Russian wheat belt. That's the only part of Russia that is sufficiently warm that during the, what am I trying to say? Can you guys hear the sirens? Should I go to a hands-free system here?
I cannot hear them.
Fantastic. Okay. The green is where people live in Russia. It's the part of the country that is just barely warm enough that you won't freeze off your nose on October 1. And that roughly overlaps with where people live. The blue that is on the right to the north, that's Tundra and Tagai, no one lives there. And the yellow to the left, to the south, is desert, and no one lives there. Now, when Russians look at this map, they get really depressed because they see all that kind of beige around the green. Places that are flat enough that you can run a tank or run a horse through, but not sufficiently economically viable to actually live in. So it's territory that has to be patrolled with a population that is already stretched out. Now, what the Russians have always been trying to do since the time of Catherine the Great is expand into these geographic barriers, places where it's pretty much impossible to invade through, and then forward position their troops into these gaps. These 9 gateway territories are the routes that all invaders have always used to attack Russian core territories. So 50-odd invasions in the last 500 years, all of them use one of these 9. During the Soviet period, the Russians controlled all 9 of them. Post-Soviet Russia went from 9 to 1. And most of what Russia has done during the Putin government has been about getting troops into those gaps. So this is the Kazakh police intervention. This is the Crimean War. This is the Georgian War. They now have 5 of them. And if they can grab Ukraine in its entirety, they will be one step away from having 7. That's what this is about. That's what this has always been about. And of course, scale matters. For those of you from Texas, Texas is not nearly as large as you think it is. The Russians are trying to do this with a population that is half that of the United States to plug gaps in a border system that's almost 3 times as long. They're always going to be mad about it. Okay, that's a map that is a little bit more accessible, so you can see what they're after. The bottom line here is that it's not just that the Russians are not going to stop until they control all of Ukraine. They're not going to stop until they've moved on past Ukraine into at least 5 NATO states. That's the why. Here's the why now. During the post-Soviet collapse in the 1990s, there was a baby bust, and there are less than half the number of people in their 20s today compared to people who are in their 30s today. Now, you'll notice that it kind of rounds out a little bit below, suggesting that maybe their demographic situation is a little bit better in the future, but the Russians literally just found 8 million children about 7 years ago and threw them into the data. They weren't there the day before. So honestly, that gap probably then goes straight down. So the Russians are literally running out of people to do this. And if they didn't do it now, it was never going to happen. Now, a lot of people are like, why would the Russians be so paranoid? Why would the Russians feel that they had to do it now? It's really simple. They believe accurately in my mind that if they can't forward position to these gateways now, they will lose the capacity in the future. And the next time there's a real war of invasion, they will be fighting in an area where they have to defend a huge amount of territory and they can't concentrate any of their defenses. And that is a recipe for death because Russia doesn't have a bottomless population now. This isn't the 1940s. They would have to do it with what they have, and what they have is wildly insufficient. So let's talk about where we are right now. This is a map from April 3, but honestly, it hasn't changed a whole lot. Step 1, a northern invasion down to Kiev. Now, we all know this kind of fell apart, but different sides took different lessons. Now, I know that the folks at DOD, when they saw this and they saw the convoy that was coming, the 40-mile convoy, and how it stopped after a day because they forgot to bring fuel, I know there's this initial bit of euphoria that, holy crap, we can totally take the Russians in a fight. And then everyone had a nap and thought about it. And confidence went to fear. Because now we know that if there's ever a direct confrontation between NATO forces and Russian forces, the Russian forces will be completely obliterated. And the Russians will have a choice between a broad-scale retreat at all points of contact, probably back to maybe even beyond the pre-war borders, or escalation. So we now know we have to prevent that conflict from ever happening. So any system that we can send the Ukrainians, anything they can operate themselves or that can be handled with like 48 hours of training, no more than that, they're getting. And people, NATO countries, are emptying out their stores. The Canadians have already run out of stuff to send, which, and I know, Canada doesn't have much of a military anymore, but still, we can't send them anything with a logistical tail because a logistical tail would require American forces to defend it, and then we would have that direct confrontation. So there's a handoff in NATO countries, the Ukrainians drive it or train it or truck it or whatever happens to be from there. And that's now policy because we're rightly horrified of what will happen if we have that direct confrontation. Next, starting in the separatist territories in the east and Crimea, the convergence upon Mariupol. Mariupol is important for more than just a land bridge. There's a road nexus there that connects Russia proper into Crimea and on into the rest of Ukraine. And if the Russians fail to secure Mariupol to their liking, then the only way that the forces in Crimea can be resupplied is through a single bridge over the Kerch Strait. And now that the United States is sending longer range weapons into Ukraine, that bridge is not long for this world, which means that Mariupol will be the only way that the Russians can supply Crimea. Keep in mind that Crimea is not an agricultural region, so all the food for the entire population there has to be imported via Russia, and once they lose that one rail line over that one bridge, Mariupol is it. So if there's going to be a counterstrike that matters by the Ukrainians, that's where it has to go. And so the Russians feel they have to take that as thoroughly and as quickly as possible. We're going to have a couple pincher actions in attempting to hive off the regular Ukrainian army from everywhere else. I'd say that the Russians are actually doing a decent-ish job of doing that right now. And then the push that I'm most concerned about personally would start in Crimea and go over to Odessa. This probably can't happen until Mariupol is completely secured. But once they get to Odessa, they will have shut off all Ukrainian exports of all type, any chance of reinforcement from the sea, and then it's a short push to Moldova where they already have forces, and then Romania is just right next door. So that's kind of where I see the war going for about the next 2 months. The Ukrainians are definitely overperforming, and the Russians are definitely underperforming. But the war in eastern Ukraine now is it's an artillery battle, and this is literally what the Russians have preferred in their wars going back to World War I. And if they don't win that, then we can talk about a war scenario where the Ukrainians might actually win this. But everything in the war right now, in my opinion, is playing to Russia's strengths rather than its weaknesses. And I don't think we've begun to see the level of devastation that is really in store here. Because the lesson that the Russians took away from Kiev is that they can't capture this going softly. And so we're seeing a civilian obliteration program for all infrastructure. The idea being that if you level an urban area, people will fall into one of two buckets. They self-segregate. One group becomes refugees and they leave and you never have to worry about them again. And anyone who remains behind is a soldier and you can shoot them on sight. And we know from German radio intercepts that the Bucha massacres were not a one-off. That's happened dozens of times in Russian occupied territory. The Russians know they don't have the population at home to repopulate this area once they take it, and so they really don't care what happens to the civilian infrastructure. We've seen them going after absolutely everything with a special emphasis on cold chain logistics for food, grain storage, and they've done what they can to damage the port of Odessa already in terms of their offloading facilities. So when they're done, there is not going to be a whole lot left in any of the zones they've gone through. That's just what artillery wars are like. Okay. Let's talk about the energy angle from the Russian point of view. The green lines are oil pipelines, the red lines are natural gas pipelines, and the dotted red along the western side of the former Soviet space is where the Russians ultimately would like to get to. First things first, the Turkish Straits. About 1.5 million barrels of Russian crude transit the Straits every year, and whenever it happens, the Turks often have to shut down traffic in both directions for some of the bigger tankers. The largest tanker that can make it through there is a 1 million barrel per day, so like a half super tanker. The Turks have activated the Treaty of Montreux that allows them to block the military passage of any belligerents at any time. Now, that means that the Russians right now cannot get their warships in and out. At the moment, the Turks are still allowing commercial cargo, but with a change in mind in Ankara, that could flip overnight. Novorossiysk, this is the primary oil offloading facility for the Russians. It has the capacity to offload about 2 million barrels a day, but it usually doesn't operate any faster than about 1.4. It's in a war zone. It's in the northern half of the Black Sea. The Russians have hit a few ships. And a little quirk of maritime law is that when there's active shooters in the area, most private insurance companies like Lloyd's of London suspend all coverage for any vessels in the area so the vessels don't go there because the ships are too expensive. The shipping companies can't afford a loss. So Novorossiysk has been operating below 20% capacity now since the beginning of the war. I don't expect that to increase. Up north, you have Primorsk, which is on the Baltic, almost as large as Novorossiysk, similar volumes, about 1.4. It's their second largest export point. Now, there's no war danger up here. The problem here is that shipping companies are refusing to go in, ship captains are refusing to go in, and most importantly, Novorossiysk, Primorsk is a shallow water port and can only take shuttle tankers. So if you want to, say, send crude to India, what you've got to do is put 6 or 7 shuttle tankers into Novorossiysk with your own sovereign indemnification, sail them out into the Baltic where it's deeper, roughly to Denmark, and then within sight of a NATO port, somehow get someone to bring out a half a dozen tugs to push 2 tankers together so you can offload from one to the other. That's a tall order. Some countries have done that and somehow think that the NATO countries are going to be okay with this in the long run. But that's the only way you can get the oil onto a tanker that is big enough to do a long multi-continental sail. Some have pulled it off, but certainly not the volume that we're used to seeing out of this port. Anywho, so Primorsk is probably operating about half capacity. Tengiz in Kazakhstan. One of the diplomatic deals that was cut with the Russians in the 1990s is they would allow oil from Tengiz to be exported using pipes that cross their territory, but only if they can put some of their own crude in it. And it all goes to Novorossiysk. So what's been going on recently is that the Russians have basically embargoed everything coming from Tengiz. They say, if anything's getting out of Novorossiysk, it's ours. So Tengiz is on the verge of shutting down already. It's already running at less than half capacity. And that's another 1.4 million barrels a day. These are the pipelines that are not long for this world, the ones that are either going through Ukraine proper or through Belarus. Now, the Germans have been getting a lot of crap with good reason that they are refusing an energy embargo because they have refineries in their capital region that date back to the Soviet era that are only supplied by pipe, that are not linked into any sort of port infrastructure. And so if these pipes go offline, we literally run out of fuel in Berlin. But here's the thing, at some point, one of two things is going to happen. Number one, in an artillery war, an artillery shell is going to hit the wrong thing and the pipe breaks. The Russians have already blown up part of Chernobyl on accident. Or number two, the Ukrainians are going to blow up their own infrastructure either before they fall or after they fall as a partisan war in order to stick to the Russians and prevent the income. So one way or another, all of these pipelines are going to be shut down. Now, the problem with all of this is that this isn't the Permian Basin in the United States. This isn't the North Sea. This isn't Saudi Arabia. This is Russia. And most of their oil's in the permafrost. Now, in the summer, permafrost is swamp, but permanent. You go down subsurface and it's always frozen. And if you push liquids through a frozen layer in a pipe, as long as the liquids are moving, they stay liquid. But should the pipes slow, should the flow stop, as happens when, say, pipelines get blown up or people stop offloading facility or offloading cargo, and so there's more pressure in the pipe. If that pressure builds up all the way back to the pipe, the liquid freezes and the wellbore cracks, and that well cannot be used again. You have to re-drill. We've seen over a dozen refineries within the Russian territories already slow or stop their operations because they don't have any way to get rid of the gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, whatever it happens to be that they've refined. And so they're slowing their uptake. So we've seen Russian exports and Russian consumption combined drop from somewhere between 2 and 3.5 million barrels a day already. And we're getting to the point where that pressure is already reaching the wellhead. And if it gets to the point that they have to shut it down, it doesn't just shut down until they decide to turn it back on. It shuts back down forever. Now, the last time the Russians had to shut in anything, it was 1992. Cold War had ended. Russian industry had collapsed, but Russian energy production continued until the pressure built up back to the wellhead. They had to shut it in. It took them 32 years to get it all back online. They didn't finish until December of 2021. So we're not talking here about Russian energy going off for a short period of time. We are talking about Russian energy going offline for decades, because the only way the Russians were able to bring that all back online was with help from the oil services firms. And now that Schlumberger and Baker Hughes and Halliburton are taking a moral stance on Russia, which is something I don't think anybody saw coming, this is it. We're going to lose 4 to 5 million barrels a day of Russian crude and another million barrels a day of Kazakh crude within the next 2 months, and it's just going to be gone. So that's the single largest disruption to oil markets ever, and it's just around the corner. Then there's natural gas. We're going to be having a point at some point in the summer where these two pipelines are going to become very important. In the north, that's Nord Stream, which goes subsea Baltic direct to Germany. In the south, we have Blue Stream, which goes subsea under the Black Sea to Turkey. These two pipes are broadly immune to the rest of the problem, certainly to the problem that the oil system is having. And so once those other pipes go offline, the Russians are going to be able to go to Berlin and Ankara and say very clearly and very accurately, look, we can keep the fuel flowing for you, only for you, but it comes at a cost. And it's not to be paid in rubles, it's to be paid in security concessions. You need to stop participating in the NATO alliance that helps Ukraine. And if we lose access to the Turkish Straits and the logistics hubs in Germany, that is the end of American support for Ukraine. Now, if you had asked me on February 21, the day before the war started, what these two countries would have done, I would have said 100% that they will cave, because they have caved to the Russians on any energy or security related question for the last 30 years. I misjudged. I think a lot of people did. And so now I'd give it a 50-50 chance. So we're talking about a scenario where a lot of Germany's already shutting down, and this prevents the lights from going out. But then again, we have seen more cohesion among the Europeans so far in this war than we have seen in Europe since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1066. We really are in strange times. All right. If you're looking for things to worry about, these are issues where Russia plus Belarus plus Ukraine as a unit, and I think we need to start thinking of them that way, economically at least, are the world's largest supplier, second largest supplier, or third largest supplier. Ukraine doesn't produce a lot of oil or natural gas. Most of that's Russia. But number one in natural gas, number two in crude, number three in coal. I mean, this is kind of a big deal, with the possible exception of coal, because there's multiple ways you can ship that. The rest of this is largely going offline. Let's say you're a green warrior. Well, you're screwed too. There is no way that we can execute the green revolution or the energy transition, or however you call it, without the Russians. Copper and platinum are two big ones. Uranium, if you decide you want to go that route. Aluminum is you need for a frame for any sort of EV system. It's just one of the things that people haven't really wrapped their heads around right now is, while yes, we can't have inexpensive, globally accessible oil without the Russians, we also can't have the green transition without them. We just don't have the materials input. Copper, it's probably the single biggest one there. And then over to nickel, next one down, because nickel's in both categories. Nickel is not only a core critical component for green tech, it's also core for making stainless steel. And the Russians are the world's largest semi-finished iron or pig iron producer. Not everybody does steel the same way. So in places that are a little bit more nationalistic, China, India, Germany, France, what happens is they buy the iron ore, they put it into a smelter, they melt it into semi-finished or pig iron, and then they further process it to get the steel that they use within their system. It's very vertically oriented. The United States is different. We have become a little bit more blasé about where we get the various components of our supply chains for this specific product. And so for environmental reasons, we've shut down all of our steel smelters. So we let someone else do that. And then we import the intermediate product, the pig iron or the semi-finished iron. And then we turn that into the best steel in the world. Well, Russia plus Ukraine are 2/3 of global pig iron supplies. Now, we do get a lot from Brazil, we do get a fair amount from Mexico, and we certainly recycle all kinds, but we're still looking at about a 20% in a reduction of our ability to access that intermediate product that we need to do everything else. So the United States is actually one of the countries that's likely to feel a bigger pinch from the steel category than anyone else. Wheat, the world's #1 wheat exporter has invaded the world's #4 wheat exporter and is going through a civilian infrastructure obliteration program. It is highly unlikely that the Ukrainians will have a harvest season this year. I mean, I'm shocked they've been able to plant as anything, much less as much as they have. They're probably going to get in the ground about 2/3 of what they had compared to last year, so that's not bad. Harvesting it is going to be a bit of a bitch. which has already doubled the price of wheat. And the last time we had an energy interruption out of the former Soviet space, we had the glory of the Arab Spring, because that's where the majority of this region's wheat goes. And the Middle East is heavily dependent on subsidies to make everything work. So in 2010, when this went down, global wheat prices doubled, but in the Middle East, they tripled. Well, they've already doubled globally. And we're probably going to see them double again by the fourth quarter when it becomes apparent just how bad the harvest is going to be. So we should be prepared for an Arab Spring-like series of protests and coups and civil wars. Remember, this is how the Syrian civil war started too, because in relative terms to 2010, it's going to be at least 2 or 3 times as expensive as it was 12 years ago. And as much as that worries me, and it does, the one that terrifies me. Russia is not just the world's largest exporter of fertilizer of all types. It is also the world's largest exporter, 40% of the total, for potash, that specific subset of fertilizer, and the second for ammonia, which is used in making nitrogen-based fertilizer. So not only are we losing the food direct, the world is losing a lot of what allows the food to grow in the first place. So the food price increases we've seen to this point are nothing compared to what's happening. There are a lot of parts in the world that simply aren't going to be able to use fertilizer this year. And based where you are, that either reduce yields by half to 80%. It really depends on the soil type. The biggest loser, again, is the Middle East. Second is a tie between Brazil and South Asia. Both of them are heavily dependent upon the former Soviet space for their fertilizer. Now, the Brazilians aren't going to starve. They're so agriculturally productive. They're the world's second largest exporter. But they export world over, and those exports are just going to shrivel this year. South Asia, that's where you're talking about famine kicking in potentially. I'm particularly worried about Pakistan, but India worries me as well. Third is sub-Saharan Africa. They take some food, they take some fertilizer, but luckily, if that's the right word, sub-Saharan African agriculture has not fully industrialized. So if they lose the industrial inputs, it won't be as much of a disaster as it will be in a place like South Asia. So those 4 regions I'm really worried about. And by the fourth quarter of this year, they're going to be under extreme pressure. And then the year after, once we chew through our wheat stocks and chew through our fertilizer stocks, it'll be even worse. So we're just getting a taste of what's to come in the end of this year.
Hey, Mr. Zeihan,
Yeah.
Troy Murphy here. May I ask you a question, please?
Go for it.
All right, and so it goes back to your previous comment concerning the green transition. So if we need Russia for the green transition, and you communicated that, the oil disruption from Russia is significant, do you see a peace deal as being something that we can achieve? Is that possible? And
No,
if it is,
the Russians are not interested in a peace deal. The Russians literally see this as an existential crisis, and I think they're reading the geography and the demography correctly. This really is their last chance. So any talk of a peace deal is going to have to be on Russian terms. The complete dismemberment of the Ukrainian military, a constitutional change to forswear membership in the EU and NATO, a demilitarized system, and the ability of the Russians to station troops in Ukraine wherever they want. And even if we get that deal, they're still going to come for Poland.
wow, so okay. I guess I'll save my other question for the rest of your talk. Thank you.
Okay. I've got more transition, but go ahead. Yeah, please.
On the other side of what you have, these seem to be levers for the Russian Belarusian set. What levers does the United States and the rest of the world have to use against Russia?
In terms of economically?
Well, with any of these things here to use against them or their government.
Oh, gotcha. The Russians kind of celebrate privation in the same way that we do apple pie. So in order to hurt Russia economically, I don't think we are capable of causing the level of pain that will cause them to shift gears. I think the best example I can give you is the Crimean War of the 1850s. In that war, the Russian system was not sufficiently industrialized, barely at all. So when the war happened, the Brits and the French were coming in with steamships that were steel. The Russians still had sailing ships that were wood. The French and the Brits had sufficient steel that they had artillery and mass production of rifles that had a range of over 1,000 yards, while the Russians were still using muskets. We had early antibiotics in the Western countries and field hospitals to prevent death from infection or disease. The Russians did not. And so the Russians got obliterated. They lost 500,000 troops. And in the end, they had to surrender because they literally couldn't ship troops to the field of battle. It's going to have to be something like that. We have to do this until the Russians cannot fight, because diplomatically and strategically, they don't see a problem here with the way the war is going to this point. I mean, would Putin like the Russian forces to do better? Yeah, but the Russians always underperform in the first year of a war. And then it becomes an artillery fight and a fight of numbers, and then the math changes. So the only way that Russia stops is if we turn Ukraine into a killing ground that destroys the Russian military's capacity to function. And we are nowhere near that yet.
So I guess I'm wondering, are they going to lose their capacity to feed their own people?
I don't think so. They can't operate a lot of the oil fields, especially the further east you go. That's really dependent upon the services firm. So it's a question of how fast that goes offline. And they've certainly have expanded what they call enterprise farms over the course of the last 15 years. And those enterprise farms are responsible for almost all of their exports. But even if you remove the support infrastructure intellectually for those two things, this is still a country with a lot of food and a lot of oil. So the lights are going to stay on, the trucks are still going to run, and there's still going to be food on the table. It's going to be Russian food without all the imported stuff that's higher quality for sure. The Russians will see their standard of living drop significantly, but I don't think we're looking at any sort of Russian famine or any sort of Russian energy crisis internally. That's one of the big advantages of the Russian system, is they export a lot of the things you need to function. And at least at this point, that's the world's problem more than it's Russia's. Okay. A quick side tour. This slide has basically been my life for the last 10 years. So first, the flags. Globalization as we understand it is a bribe. At the end of World War II, we told everybody that instead of having an imperial system where each imperial economic network is warring with the others, we're going to use our Navy, the only Navy to survive the war, to patrol the global ocean so that anyone can go anywhere at any time and interface with any partner and participate in any supply chain and access any resources and sell into any market. If in exchange, you all line up shoulder to shoulder, not behind us, not with us, but in front of us to absorb any ammo that might come in from Moscow. We bribed up an alliance to fight the Cold War, and it worked. And then the Cold War ended. And in the next 7 presidential elections, we elected the guy who was less interested in maintaining a global network. And that includes the jump from Trump to Biden. That's not an aberration, that's a trend. Americans are just done. We will see if the Ukraine war changes that. I have some hopes, but we're only 2 months in, and the alliance has not started to fracture yet. If it does, that changes the math on both sides. Second, the demographic profiles. So children on the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees on the top, men on one side, women on the other. Canada on the left that's the data from 1965. This is what we used to consider as normal. That's how it was globally. But globalization changed that. It used to be the only countries that could industrialize were those small handful with really good geographies, your Britons, your Frances, your Japans, your Americas. But once globalization went global, all the technologies and economic patterns that industrialization allows could make it anywhere. And people started taking advantage of that. People started specializing, and people started moving off of the farm and into the cities. When you're on the farm, your kids are free labor. When you're in the cities, they're really, really expensive conversation pieces. And so you have fewer of them. And the Canada of 1965 turned into the Canada of today. That has happened everywhere in the world, on their own time and their own pace, but it's happened everywhere. As you age, the math of your life changes. When you're a young adult, it's all about consumption. As you are driving the economy, it is all about raising kids and buying cars and buying homes. But when you're in your 50s, you're a high value added worker, but you're not consuming as much. You're saving more. So left to right, consumption, investment, low tax base, high tax base, importer, exporter. And the whole world has gone from the left to the right. United States, we are a partial difference. The baby boomers are the generation that matters the most. They're the largest generation we've ever had, and they are doing what everyone at their age group does. They are retiring. So we're losing our single largest worker cadre. At the same time, we're using our single largest skill cadre. I don't want to try to talk you out of being concerned about inflation. And monetary inflation is an issue. War disruptions are an issue. Supply chain disruptions are an issue. That's all true. But they all combined pale compared to what's happening in the American labor market right now, because the boomers are leaving and they are never coming back. Now, the next, yeah, we don't need to talk about, well, let's talk about finance real quick. It's relevant. As you age, your income increases. As you age, your spending decreases, which means your net capital position gets better. The amount of money that you can invest and save for retirement increases, and it peaks the decade before you retire. So this is just showing what total average net worth in the United States is. And then it starts to fall off. If anything, it falls off faster than this would suggest. Because after 65, mortality really kicks in, and you have a lot of couples that lose one, and all the assets transfer over. This keeps that in data that's relevant to this. Now, what this means is if you want to do anything, and that doesn't matter what it is, build an aircraft carrier, build a road, buy a car, the capital environment we're in right now is perfect, because the baby boomers are at their capital peak. But a year from now, the majority of the baby boomers will be retired. So instead of having deep, liquid, available pools of capital, everything's going to become a lot more expensive as the capital environment just shrivels up. So we saw the absolute cheapest mortgage rates that we have ever had in history last year. You were able to get a mortgage for under 3%, which is just stupid. We're already seeing that unwind. And at this time next year, it's probably going to be something closer to double. Part of that is interest rates in the Federal Reserve, not absolutely true, but most of it has to do with overall capital availability, and that's demographic. And those numbers are in the process of turning right now. There is a partial exception. The gray and the yellow is the same data from before. That's average. The blue and the orange is what it looks like if you factor out the top 1%. Now, in the United States, about half of all financial assets are controlled by the top 1%. And if you retire with $50 million, you know you're not going to need all of that. So the issue becomes, what does that do to capital costs? Well, in the United States, that 1%, half of all financial assets, they're probably going to leave about half of their assets, so 1/4 of the total, economically engaged in the stock market and the bond market, because they know they don't need it all. And they're also going to start transferring funds to the next generation or to charities. So that takes some of the sting out of a financial system. But this only works in places that have deep pools of liquidity, large financial markets, and screaming inequality. And there's only two places like that in the world, the United States and Luxembourg. Everyone else is going to be looking at capital costs at least increasing by a factor of 6 or 7. In the United States, it's probably only going to be 3 or 4. Now, the Americans have had help. Let me say it again. The American baby boomers have had help with, hang on for just a second. Someone's knocking on my door. I'll be right back. Oops. Sorry about that. Apparently, I put up the needed service sign instead of the do not disturb sign. That has been addressed. Okay, so when the baby boomers entered the market, there were so many of them that they pushed down the cost of labor relative to other systems and in compared to American history as well. At the same time, we had a big Mexican wave that started in the 1960s that never really let up. And so we had baby boomers, a large generation, and Mexicans, an inexpensive workforce, moving into the American labor market at the same time, and that held until now. And that means that the United States has the lowest cost of labor and some of the highest productivity per unit of labor in the entire world, certainly of the advanced world. But the baby boomers are now retiring, and check this out. 25 years, Mexico started belatedly to industrialize. They had the tequila crisis. They decided they needed to shift gears. They went into manufacturing. People started moving off the farms and into the cities. And so we saw their birth rate halve. Now, Mexicans are not vanishing from the world, but it does mean that they have become a limited resource. And net migration from Mexico to the United States has now been negative for 12 of the last 13 years. It'll probably never be positive again. And so we are looking at a quantum shift in labor. You guys are certainly going to feel that in recruitment. Here's Central America. Same process, started 5 to 10 years later. So this idea of migrant caravans coming across the border, we're in the last couple of years of that happening because the Central Americans are just running out of young people. Okay, next generation down from the boomers. This is Gen X. This is me. I'm part of what was until recently the smallest generation in American history. And when we look at the baby boomers, we don't like what we see from any number of measures. But from a labor point of view, we didn't like the fact that they valued their money over their time. So there were a lot of boomers. They pushed down the cost of labor. So a lot of boomer families felt that the only way they could make ends meet is for the second spouse to enter the workforce. That pushed down the cost of labor even more and put a lot of financial strain on boomer households. That's one of the reasons why the boomers have the highest divorce rate in American history. Gen X looked at this. We're like, we want no part of that. Excuse me. COVID. So we are far more likely to be single income households. And if that means an economic hit, that means an economic hit. Our time is at least as important to us as our money. That's worked against us for our entire professional lives. We are the generation of being an intern endlessly. But now, with the boomers vacating all of those upper positions at the same time, we're stepping into a space where we couldn't possibly fill all the shoes. The boomers were a large generation with a high labor participation rate, while Gen X is a smaller generation with a lower labor participation rate. Now, this is great for Gen X right now. We're seeing labor price appreciation for the first time in our lives, and it's brilliant. But for everyone else, it's a bit of a disaster because we know that among skilled labor in particular, we have at least another 10 years of labor inflation ahead of us, probably closer to 15. The generation at the bottom, these are the Zoomers, these are Gen X's kids. And they are not millennials. Millennials are collegiate, they're cooperative, they're good at the touchy-feely skills, they're good at management. Zoomers are good at none of those things. Zoomers were raised by Gen X, and we told them very directly, Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, they're not going to be there for me, so they're certainly not going to be there for you. You will always be outvoted by the millennials, just like we were always outvoted by the boomers. You'll probably never have a president, just like we will never have a president. If you want to get ahead, you have to literally be ahead, and not just of your class, of everyone. They're antisocial, they have the highest suicide rate in the country, and their dream job is to be in a locked closet in the dark coding. The worst thing that has happened to the Zoomers so far isn't COVID. They loved COVID because they had an excuse to never see other people. The worst thing that's happened to them is an end to COVID, because now they actually have to interface with people, and it's not something that most of them are comfortable with. This is the future of the labor force. This is the future of your recruitment, because they're all already here. They've all already been born. We know exactly what the labor force for the next 20 years is going to look like. And then finally, we've got the millennials. There are two groups of millennials. The first group match the negative stereotypes: lazy, entitled, mom drives them to work, still live in the basement, all that good stuff. The second group has always done everything that we have always expected of them. They graduated from college a semester early. They didn't go on a walkabout. They went right into the workforce. And because of that, they got screwed. The good millennials, if you will, when the financial crisis hit, they were the last ones to join companies, so they were the first ones shown the door when the mass firing started. So whether it's because they went to Europe for 5 years to find themselves, or because they did everything right and just got fired because of circumstance, today's millennials have missed out on 3 to 5 years of formative work experience in their 20s, and they will never get that back. Which means that they'll always be behind until the day they retire. The hope for the labor force, the only chance we have of getting back to where we were in 2019, isn't with the millennials directly. It's with the millennials' kids. We have to wait for them to grow up, get trained, and enter the workforce. And that doesn't happen en masse until 2045. So the environment that we're dealing with economically in the United States and what your recruitment pictures look like are pretty stark, but they're also already known. These trends are already in play. No more millennials are ever going to be born. Their oldest ones are already in their 40s. No more Zoomers are going to be born. So we know exactly what the demographic looks like for at least the next 25 years. And it's just something we have to learn to work with. Much worse in China. Oh my God, so
Can I go
bad.
back and ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
So what are the millennials going to have to do with their children to be this amazing population of our hope? What is your recommendation there?
Yeah, I mean, these people, for the most part, have not been born yet, so we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. As a rule, you do things differently than your parents did when it comes to raising kids. So I am not worried about the next generation, whatever we call it, of acting like the millennials. It's going to be something different. It would probably, just historically speaking, be something a lot more similar to Gen X. But the snowflake thing has virtually gone away, thank God. It was never as big as we thought it was. It was more for those millennials who were kind of stuck on themselves as opposed to ones that actually show up to work. I can't give a recommendation because everything about how we educate now is changing so rapidly. Things like Khan Academy are providing options that just didn't exist 10 and 15 years ago. I'm literally punting on that question. I don't know. Sorry.
No problem. I'm selfishly asking because I'm in that category and I have kids.
I hear you. Well,
yeah.
I can't speak to how you were raised, but I can tell you that the more people are willing to be around people certainly helps.
Thanks.
No problem. For what it's worth. I don't feel like that was hugely helpful, but speaking of not hugely helpful, here's the Chinese demography in 1950, standard pre-industrial pyramid. 30 years on, here we are. This is early industrial China, and this is the shape that terrified Mao. He saw a young and upcoming generation that would literally eat China alive, and his solution was the one-child policy. Years after one child, we get this. Not a lot of kids, but that big bulge of people in their 20s and early 30s. When Americans look at this, we see an up and coming generation that's going to take away everyone's engineering jobs and manufacturing jobs. When the Chinese look at this, they see an up and coming young generation of spenders that are going to remake consumption norms. We were all correct. Were, past tense, because here's China now. As of January of 2020, when this data was pulled, China was already the fastest aging society in human history with the biggest sex imbalance. We already knew that their economic model would not match up with this demography this decade. We always knew that the economic collapse of China was coming. But since this data came out, the Chinese have started releasing parts of their 2020 decade census. And they're now grudgingly admitting that they overcounted their population by about 100 million people. And that the truth is probably closer to this, with the yellow bars just not existing. This would suggest, and I say suggest because they haven't released everything, this would suggest that by the year 2050, there'll be half as many Chinese alive as there are now. I don't see how China survives as a single political entity, much less a globally significant one. I don't see how it survives this decade with these numbers, because this suggests that the Chinese population peaked back in 2003, and that Chinese economic efficiency probably peaked around the same time, and that we've already been on a relatively accelerated slide. Now, we can't go to China and do a nose count just to make sure.
On the previous slide, I'm sorry, is Tory Murphy here, Captain U.S. Navy.
Sure.
I don't think I really ever heard it characterized that way with respect to the demographics in China and the potential impacts when you look out to maybe, let's say, 2050.
Sure.
So when we have the great power competition discussions, right? It's all economics, it's all military, all the elements of the dime. But what you're saying is that from basically internal to the country, they could almost implode under their own weight or the lack of a population. Is that what I'm hearing?
We're going to go into a number of other China adjacent issues in the rest of this presentation and show how each individual one is a regime killer. This is just the first.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, no problem. It's I do not worry about China at all. Now, if you're in the Navy, I can understand why there's some heartburn there. It's like you're probably preparing for a war that will never happen, but I'd rather you do that than what the Russians have done and not actually prepare.
Right.
But I do not think that we are going to find ourselves in a world where we have to face down China, because I do not think there is going to be a China for very much longer.
Interesting. Thanks.
No problem. We can't confirm this. We can't just go to China and look around and count noses. But here are some data that are like demographics adjacent that we do trust. So this is the average wages for a number of Southeast Asian countries that I think we should be interfacing with more, because I think they're going to do very well in the future. Here are our Mexican compadres, very competitive, and here are the Chinese. This is the fastest labor appreciation in human history, including during the Black Death, including during all wars. So we're looking at a 15-fold increase since 1999. Their labor effectiveness, productivity, has probably only increased by a factor of 2, maybe 3. There is not an industrial process that is done in China that can't be done in North America at a lower cost, because our labor is so much more productive, our energy is so much cheaper, our supply lines are so much shorter, and you can produce stuff where people actually live, so the transport costs are minor. The only reason we think of China as a major industrial player is because of the sunk cost of the pre-existing industrial plant. You don't rebuild that somewhere else overnight, but it is happening. The United States is already in the process of its fastest industrialization, even faster than what we did during World War II. But it's a lot to move a few $1 trillion of industrial plant from one place to another. You don't do that overnight. We're living in the moment right now. We probably need to double the size of our industrial plant in the next 5 to 10 years. That'll be awkward, expensive, inflationary. But on the other side of it, we will have a far more insulated and secure supply chain system. The problem is just getting from here to there, and that is not a straight line, and there are a lot of bumps.
Hey, Peter, can I jump in really quick?
Of course.
Oh, sorry. Marie Slack, United States Army. So I hate to take you back a slide, but I just wanted to follow up with one of what Tori asked you.
Yeah, sure.
So your response was, you know, you don't think the regime will last a couple decades, that you're not worried about China.
I don't think it will last this decade, to be specific.
Okay. So why, I just want your opinion on why you think they wouldn't take the same position as Russia, like, hey, well, this is the time to do it. This is the only time I'll be successful if I try. So let's go all in now, you know, take Taiwan, take whatever, you know, reunify, do everything they wanted to do in their grand strategy, and be desperate enough to do that. Why do you think that wouldn't happen? I mean, they've spent all the money building up their forces and everything. Why wouldn't they take that chance, in your
Great
opinion?
question. I was going to deal with that a little bit later, but we'll bring it forward if it makes sense here too. The Chinese plan has always been to let the Russians go first, just to kind of as a proof of concept. And so their thinking was a fast war that conquers Taiwan in a matter of days, that imposes a done deal upon the world, and everyone just sucks it up and takes it because China is too economically powerful to be challenged. And once you hold the territory, there's no point in going to a broad scale war against the Chinese when it's already happened. That's always been their plan. Oh my, with the Russians, they have had every aspect of all of their planning for the last 40 years set on fire and burned to ash in less than a month. So number one, it will not be a quick war because Ukraine was one of the world's less militarily competent countries in the first place, and they're still holding it out against the Russians. Taiwan has been preparing for this war since 1955. Taiwan has a moat. Taiwan has a nuclear program that started in 1974. So if we have a 2-month accumulation of Chinese forces getting ready to push, the Taiwanese will see it because this is the only national security question that they pay any attention to. And they will make a nuclear device. And so the only way that the Chinese can even make an attempt on Taiwan is to text all of their soldiers at the same time and just say, everyone get to the coast, take a fishing boat with your buddies and start moving on Taiwan. They know it is going to cost them 1 million troops just to get there. So it's always been a heavier carry than we would ever consider in the way that we operate. But for the Chinese, they know baked into the equation that it's going to be 1 million troops lost before they can even start the real war. And they now know from Ukraine that it's not going to be a pushover. It's not going to be, because, you know, Taiwan is mountainous, it's forested, as opposed to Ukraine, which is flat and open and very few forests. Second, the sanctions. Russia has many flaws, but they're a massive producer of food and energy products. If you put the sanctions that we have put against Russia onto China, oh my, China imports 85% of their energy, 85% of that from the Persian Gulf, and they import 85% of the inputs that are necessary to grow their food. So you would have an industrial collapse, a civilizational breakdown, and mass famine within 6 months. And then you would probably lose 500 million Chinese over the course of the next year to famine. But I think the one that has scared the Chinese the most are the boycotts. BP and Halliburton didn't have to leave. They weren't doing anything that was sanctioned. But the super majors and the oil services firms and countless other firms left on a moral imperative prompted by individual shareholders and consumers. And in China, the idea that the average Joe or Jane can influence policy is so antithetical to their mindset that they had no idea this was even possible, much less it was going to happen. So everything that the Chinese have based their system and their strategic policy on for the last 30 years has been proven in the last 2 months to be utterly wrong. And they have to come up with a completely new plan. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but I don't think they can. I don't think they have that capacity anymore. And so we just have Chairman Xi slamming his head into the wall over and over and over, incapable of change until his skull cracks. And that's where we are now. I see China with not just a demographic failure, but a failure of leadership, a failure of policy, an agricultural failure, and an energy failure all at the same time. It is entirely possible that this is the last year of the People's Republic. But I'm getting ahead of myself.
Peter, David Chattels, U.S. Air Force, if I may. So on the next slide, you had mentioned manufacturing base in the United States versus the manufacturing base in China, and that transition from, all the work that has been done since the 70s to build a manufacturing base in China.
Sure.
But your point about the workforce, the labor cost, my question is, between unionized labor and environmental laws and worker protections in the United States that don't exist in China, were those costs baked into your analysis on the fact that on your statement of the United States being cheaper personnel-wise than China?
Absolutely. The Chinese don't have a very high value-added economy, and so in that sort of environment, if you are willing to dumb down labor costs, and if you're willing to dumb down environmental restrictions, it does give you a leg up. Absolutely. But because the United States produces energy at home versus importing it from several thousand miles away, our energy costs are so much cheaper. And because our educational system is so much better and American workers are so much higher value added, we have now reached a point where the math has flipped. And Chinese labor has become so expensive, it obviates all those other advantages. So like Mexican labor is half the cost and more highly skilled than Chinese labor, and that makes a big difference too. And remember, I said North American, so we do have a partner in this that makes the math work that way.
Copy. I missed that nuance. Thanks.
No, that's right. And I'm not trying to suggest that labor restrictions, environmental restrictions don't come at a cost. I'm also not trying to suggest that all of them are necessary. We have 50 states with 50 different labor markets and 50 different environmental sets of regulations, and some of them obviously are better at dealing with this than others.
And that's why there are car manufacturer plants on the Alabama-Georgia border.
For example, absolutely. Okay, back to energy. We're just kind of weaving in and out. This is total investment from all companies, state-owned and private, into all oil and all natural gas conventionally since 2010. In 2014, a narrative took hold that fossil fuels were done. Since it takes 3 to 8 years for a conventional oil or natural gas field to produce its first output, the argument was, why would you invest in something that isn't going to produce for several years, and it's going to take you 20 years to pay it back the investment cost if we're all not going to be using oil and natural gas in 20 years? Now, we can all have a good laugh at how optimistic that was, but it took hold in New York and in Tokyo and Paris and in London, and so total investment into all oil and natural gas dropped by 2/3 over the course of the next decade. Most places. This is one of my favorite maps. Every dot is someone who can pay the power bill, so I call it the checkbook map. Here are the conventional oil and natural gas basins of the world. You'll notice that most of those green blobs are inconveniently far away from where the lights are. So a lot of the fun and games of the last 75 years under the globalized order has been about getting the energy from where it's produced to where people actually lived. And this was America's responsibility, because we told everyone that if you're on our side, we will cover the economic basis from a security point of view so you can do whatever you feel you need to do. That included making sure that oil would get to them. And so most of our foreign policy, especially when it comes to the Persian Gulf, has been about making sure that the oil can continuously flow. Now, these are the conventional fields, but here are the shale fields, and look particularly at North America and the Arabian Peninsula. This changes everything. Even if shale were entirely identical to the energy sector, the fact that in North America, most of the output is co-located to population centers means that for the United States, we don't have to maintain a globalized energy network in order to keep our lights on. So the biggest beneficiary for this kind of strategic drag we have seen in the last 30 years, where we're kind of going through the motions of providing for globalization, but we're really not invested in it from either an economic or a security point of view. The biggest beneficiary of that is by far been China, because we have made the Persian Gulf safe so that China can import regional energy. And now that we no longer have many troops in the Persian Gulf, and now that we've withdrawn our naval assets, that world no longer exists. And the next time there's an energy crisis, like for, I don't know, maybe the Russians invade someone, we will have a global energy build intention at the same time that there's no supply interruptions within the United States system. Here's a zoom in on the upper Midwest. This is the most important city in the history of human civilization. Marshalltown, Iowa, that's what I'm from. This is Bismarck, North Dakota, and this is not a rave. In a lot of places, when you produce oil, natural gas is co-produced, often as a waste product. That happens in a big way in the shale fields in North Dakota and in Texas. Now, it takes us months to build out the infrastructure to capture this stuff. And in the meantime, we just flare it, which means that the world's base industrial material, natural gas, in the United States and only in the United States is a waste product. And that changes the math for pretty much everything that we do from an industrial and an energy point of view. So we now use natural gas as our primary electricity fuel because it's almost free. We also have replaced it within our industrial processes in order to remove oil from our petrochemical system. We just run on natural gas now. Cost structures. So the taller the bar, the higher the break even. This is back from 2012. The light blue on the far left is where shale was 10 years ago. Everything in black on the right, that is all OPEC. But the math has changed because the technology has improved. And just before COVID happened, we had actually dropped below the average OPEC production cost for our crude. Now, every company is going to say that, oh, no, it's higher than that. But it's not. A lot of companies are using their shale sales to subsidize our other parts of their business, and everyone would like a healthy profit margin. And a lot of companies have a lot of debt to pay down from when they borrowed in order to produce when crude costs twice as much as it does now to produce. But now it's pretty simple for most companies to have a profit margin that's healthy at $60, much less where we are today at over 100. And this has a lot of impact on all things natural gas. This is Henry Hub prices for natural gas. That's the Texas hub for distribution, going back to roughly 1997. For those of you who are in Texas, you will remember these three events. These are hurricanes. Every time a hurricane would come through the Gulf, and back then, pre-shale, we got half of our natural gas from the Gulf. They would have to shut down the rigs, evacuate everybody. The storm would blow through, then they'd have to go back and untangle the pipes on the seabed and get everything going again. And it resulted in price spikes that would last several months, maybe even more. But by the time we got to 2009, the shale sector had matured enough that we were getting half of our natural gas from onshore projects. Every shale well is onshore. And then we got the price environment of the next decade. It was pretty good. Now, for those of you from Texas, you of course will know what this is. Natural gas prices doubled last winter because in Texas it got cold, and Texas does not deal well with cold. And then this is what we're bitching about right now. From the American point of view, from the American consumer's point of view, natural gas prices have doubled in the last several months, and everyone is all up in arms. But we haven't even gotten to the 50-year average yet. It's just that we had a period from 2009 to relatively recently when natural gas has been the cheapest it has ever been anywhere in the world for 10 long years. And we got used to it. We thought of it as normal. What's going on, though, is when natural gas is free, you use a lot of it. So we expanded our consumption footprint with LNG, with piped exports to Mexico, with more chemical production, with more electricity production, and we have gobbled up all the free stuff. So we're going through a degree of price discovery right now for the first time, and we don't really like it because natural gas used to be free. You think it's not fair, but here are the equivalent prices for the Europeans and the Chinese. Yeah. Natural gas has gotten so expensive in Europe that they're not even using it to make fertilizer anymore because it's too expensive. So the war has given us a potash shortage. And the natural gas price disconnect, in part because of the war, but more because of we had 10 years of lack of investment. That's given us a nitrogen fertilizer shortage at the same time. Petrochemicals. This is a very complicated graphic. Let me just simplify it. Start on the bottom left with crude oil. You refine that into something called naphtha, and that makes thousands of daughter products we use every day. Or you can start with natural gas on the bottom right, crack it to get something called ethylene, and then that makes all kinds of products. Normally, you would only use natural gas to make this specific product set, because those are the things you can only make with natural gas. Oil will not allow you to make those. But the reason we do that is because normally there's a huge price disconnect between oil and natural gas. Normally, oil is considered so expensive, so difficult to transport and store that there's a 5-to-1 price ratio between natural gas and oil. But because of the quirks of the shale field, and the fact that the fields are closer to the population centers, for us, the price differential is only about 2-to-1, which means we use natural gas now to make this product set. And that's pretty much everything that is not made out of an organic material that you can see within the room you're in right now. This is glass, this is diapers, this is condoms, this is chewing gum, this is engine coolant, this is home furnishings, this is fertilizer, this is pesticide. It's a lot of stuff. And in the United States, and only in the United States, it is now being produced at a lower cost than anywhere else in the world. We now make all the intermediate products in higher volumes and higher quality than anyone else on the planet can. So the first stage was getting to that intermediate input stage, and now we've moved into the actual heavy manufacturing to bring all this stuff back. And there's no country in the world that is competitive. The Europeans and the Chinese specifically try to buy shipments of just our ethylene in order to keep their own chemical systems running, but they can't do it with oil and be competitive anymore. So we're seeing the United States grab big chunks of market share every single year from everyone. And at the rate we're going within the next decade, assuming nothing else changes, which of course is a hilarious statement considering the world we're in, you're looking at the United States being the majority producer for all this stuff. Okay. Foodstuffs. I think I got a couple slides out of order here. Hang on for just a second. Oh well, I'll deal. The map on the left, this is crop coverage in Africa in the year 1950. Anything that is in blue or pink is roughly 1/3 of the land or less is under production. And in a pre-industrialist system, this is broadly what you would expect. Because if you don't have the capital or the equipment or the fertilizer, you're only going to farm the lands that are easy to farm. And that means that most lands actually are not going to be under cultivation. But 50 years later, Africa looked like this. This is what farm equipment, pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, and especially imported capital allow you to do. The footprint physically expanded, and each acre became more productive. We're now in the midst of a deglobalization wave, and the inputs for agriculture are at the leading edge of it. So from the left to the right, Africa increased their food output by a factor of 5. But also from the left to the right, Africa increased its population by a factor of 6. Now we go something from right to left, which suggests we're about to have some demand destruction in agriculture, also known a lot of people dying by famine. Give you an idea of who's going to hurt the most. This is a calorie map. This is by far the most depressing graphic I've ever put together. The blues and the greens, the dark greens, are the world's major exporters of grain and soy-based calories. But if you interrupt the input streams, these are the ones looking at least a 40% reduction in their ability to grow the crop in the first place, because they can't source things themselves very well. Over the next few years, we're probably going to lose 1 billion people from famine as globalization breaks down. And the Russians have ensured that this starts in the fourth quarter of this year. I know this is an energy event and we have a lot more energy to come, but I really, really hope that the US military starts focusing on this a little bit more, because a war over oil is a war between two near-peer powers. And if one loses access to the oil, they fall away. The industrialization process goes in reverse very quickly, and they are not a threat to the industrialized power again. But if two food poor countries are next to each other, you can have incessant ongoing war until both of them collapse. And historically speaking, we have plenty of examples of what this looks like, and none of them are pretty. Right, back to oil. Back in 2007, before shale oil became a thing, we had 3 big centers of demand. North America and Western Europe would take crude from all points of the compass, and anything that was left would make the long haul around South and Southeast Asia to Northeast Asia, an area that produces very little of its own. And so the East Asians usually had to pay a premium to get crude because they just got whatever was left. You fast forward 8 years, and the shale revolution had reduced American oil imports by 7 million barrels a day. And so we were finding the North American system become more and more isolated because it didn't have to be integrated. In Western Europe, they had 8 years of financial collapse, and so overall energy demand dropped. The only organic demand growth we saw was in Northeast Asia. And so all of a sudden, that's where all the flows went. And just check out how thick that bar is going from the Persian Gulf to the Chinese and Japanese systems. Now, the Asians got a bit of a discount because they were the only game in town. Now, in 2015, something really interesting happened. The Republicans in Congress, combined with the Obama administration, changed the rules. And we now, as of 2015, started allowing the export of crude from the American system. And so today we've got a much more integrated energy system than we have ever had before, at least from the North American point of view. The West Africans started sending anything they could anywhere, and the Russians had some incremental increases. This is the picture of the now. Now, what's going to happen? Oh, yeah, and check out how big this flow is, because that's the world's biggest flow, period. Now, that 2015 law has a fun little quirk in it. It allows the American presidents, not just Biden, any president, to summarily, by executive order, end the oil export ban. Now, what we do today is we export a lot of light sweet from the crude that comes out of the shale fields, and we import a lot of heavy sours that come from wherever in the world, because that's what our refineries were designed for back in the 1980s. But with what's happening in Russia, we're going to lose 4 to 5 million barrels of Russian crude and probably another million barrel a day of Kazakh crude very soon. That is probably going to send oil prices up to a point, I'm guessing above 170, that is going to be incredibly uncomfortable and very recessionary for most places, the United States included. But Biden has the ability to, with the flick of a pen, stop American crude exports. And in that environment, our system becomes closed off from the world. It becomes super saturated, and we follow our own logistical issues, and we follow our own price model. This is how the world worked back before World War II. Be a British price, a German price, a Japanese price, and so on. It's about to happen again. I'm guessing this summer. And in that environment, you can have a price of $70 or below in the United States when the rest of the world is 2 and 3 times that. Because the United States is about to take action that means that the Russian oil and the American oil is denied the global market at the same time. And that is more than enough to trigger a global energy-induced depression that the Americans just kind of saunter right on by. This, the map of today, we lose the Russian crude, we lose Oh, shit. I forgot to say that from earlier. Forget it. And we lose the American crude at the same time, and we turn into something a lot. Man. Sorry, I'm doing this without my command screen, so I can't see my own notes. I can't remember where I put what slide. All right, these two things that popped up that I forgot about. Let's talk first about the light blue X on the far right. Russian crude goes in two directions from two different basins. So Western Siberian crude goes into the European network, and it has minimal connections to the Eastern network, where Eastern Siberian crude goes into the Chinese network. Russia did very little of the work in Eastern Siberia because they don't have the technical skill. They've had a bit of a collapse in their educational system. Fields in Eastern Siberia may be rich, but they're deeper, they're smaller, they're more remote, and they're more expensive to tap. So the services firms have been doing most of that. The services firms are gone. So the Chinese are having to get by with whatever the Russians can maintain in a system where the Russians did not do the initial work or much of the maintenance work. We're probably going to see a lot of really impressive industrial accidents in Eastern Russia because the people who used to prevent them are gone. So anything that was built in Eastern Russia with the intent of selling to China has already peaked. And it's just a question of how fast it falls off the market. So the Chinese are likely to get less energy by the end of this year from the Russians than they got previous to the war. Second, that red block down off of Africa. In an environment where the Europeans lose access to a lot of their Russian crude, and where the American crude goes away as well, the Europeans are going to have to go south and interface with their former colonies and convince them, one way or another, that that crude now needs to flow north to Europe rather than east to China. Give you an idea of the scale of that. On the left, you've got all the inflows that go into East Asia. On the right, you've got all the outflows that come from West Africa. Everything in yellow is what's in question. All the yellows on the right are going to be going north to Europe. All the yellows on the left are going to stop. Now, the long and the short of the last several slides is that the world we are moving into, the Chinese are going to have to suck up the entirety of the entire shortfall from the entire Ukraine war. We are talking a minimum of 5 million barrels a day that the Chinese just aren't going to have. So their overall ability to source crude is dropping by over a third. And there is no way you do that without an industrial stop. That's probably going to happen before the end of the year. We're that close. So this turns into that. North America goes its own way. The Europeans suck up whatever they can, and the East Asians have to duke it out over the rest. And there's just not enough. The Chinese do have a navy. It is large. It does have a number of ships, but 90% of them cannot sail more than 1,000 miles from the coast. And even that assumes that they're moving slow to conserve speed. They're going in a straight line and no one is shooting at them. The Chinese utterly lack the capacity to put a navy in the Indian Ocean, regardless of clashes with Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, or India. They just can't do it. So in any war scenario, someone's going to put a couple of destroyers in the Indian Ocean, maybe the Japanese, maybe us, and that is the end of the Chinese industrial experience completely, assuming that the lights just don't go out this year and never come back online.
Hey, sir, it's
Sure.
American Davis. Got a quick question.
Shoot.
America goes at it alone and only do oil with ourselves. Do you foresee that driving a wedge between us and our NATO allies over in Europe?
I think that's a very good question, and that is definitely going to be a problem. There's a lot of ways that what the Biden administration is attempting with a strategic reboot can go the wrong way. But something to keep in mind, I think the biggest problem here is that the globalization deal that we struck with our allies back in 1945, guns and butter in exchange for you being on our side versus the Soviets, no post-Cold War president has expressed an interest in rebooting that. What Biden is trying to do right now is get all the security aspects of that up and running again without any of the economic concessions. Biden and Trump are the two most economically populist leaders we have had in over a century. And when we get to a point where the Europeans have to choose between security and economics, I don't know how that is going to fall. But your question cuts to the core of what makes American security policy during the Cold War work. And those circumstances do not exist now. Unless we have some sort of like Bretton Woods 2 discussion over what globalization means in the light of American security policy, until we have that, we're just kind of whistling in the dark here.
Seems like the next couple of years of NDU, when it comes to econ and great power competition, based off how this year plays out,
Absolutely.
going to have a lot of stuff to study and come up with different scenarios.
Yeah, we're all gonna be very, very busy. That's for sure. That assumes all of that, including the conversation. That assumes that nothing really bad goes wrong. So here are the world's shipping lines. The thicker the bar, the more traffic. All of the red circles are choke points. There is no naval power in the world that can reach more than one of them at a time except the United States. We can reach them all. My biggest concern for the future of this world is not so much that the United States moves away from its alliance network. It's that the United States, once it becomes completely economically isolated, which we're very close to now, flips. And instead of guaranteeing global commerce, we're willing to mess with it to achieve this or that goal. We need to start thinking of what happens when the United States is no longer the guarantor of order and instead becomes an agent of disorder, because I don't think we're that far off. And if, for example, the Germans flip in this conversation on Ukraine, that might be enough to shift the United States into that role. If the Chinese and the Indians prove a degree of success in getting crude out of the western flowing Russian points, that might be enough to piss us off that we play this role. And once we prove that we can do it, once we prove how easily we can do it, think of the presidents that we have had in the last 25 years and how they've relied more and more on military aspects of policy rather than diplomatic or economic ones. Now they can simply shut off the energy flows if they want to in a day. It's not hard for us. And there's really not a lot that anyone else in the world can do. It affects their prices, not ours. Right, back to China. Xi has created a cult of personality that is the most intense in Chinese history. More so than Mao, more so than the emperors of old. It's almost as tight. In fact, you could argue in some ways that it's tighter than Kim Il-sung in North Korea. Now, this has a lot of implications, but I think the single biggest one is that no one wants to bring Xi any information. Not information he'll disagree with, any information. He now combines the worst characteristics of Trump and Obama. Obama was famous for not wanting to talk to people. You could only come into the White House to speak with him if you were bringing something that he agreed with and you had 90 seconds to say it, then you had to get out. Trump, he'd talk to anyone, but not necessarily about what the topic of the day happened to be. She's both of those, but like taken to absurd extremes. And he has now exiled or executed or intimidated into silence everyone in the PRC that is capable of independent thought. One of the big concerns I have right now in this Ukraine war situation is that Xi literally does not know what's going on in his own country. And he no longer has a brain trust of people that he can put in a room and give them a bunch of beer and coffee and tell them to come up with a backup plan, because that brain trust no longer exists. It's just him. Now, we've got a couple of interesting crises that are building with everything else we've got going on. The first is COVID. The Chinese vaccine, when it came out in 2021, was 55% effective at preventing death versus the original wild strain out of Wuhan. And they have not been able to improve on the vaccine since then. Compare that to Moderna and Pfizer that were 98% effective at preventing infection versus that original strain. Now, in the shift from Alpha to Delta to Omicron B, our best guess is that the mRNA vaccines that we use are about 95% effective at severe death, but they're not very useful against infections. I'm sorry, 95% against severe cases, like 99% effective against death. The Chinese vaccine is probably in the low teens in its effectiveness versus death, and it doesn't do a damn thing versus infection. So the Chinese have a vaccine that doesn't work. And in a system where the one-man rule has based its legitimacy on health policy, the only tool the government has available is lockdowns. And since it's a cult of personality, everyone just does what they think the big man wants to do. So Shanghai, the world's largest manufacturing and transport hub, is in lockdown. Guangzhou, the world's second largest manufacturing and transport hub, is in lockdown. And probably next week, Beijing goes down too. This is China's new normal. China is stuck with this policy until such time as it collapses or they bring in $3 trillion of someone else's vaccine, which is not going to happen. China is removing itself from global manufacturing supply chains. And one of my things that I'm talking with my manufacturing clients about is just, if you haven't started moving by now, if you haven't read the writing on the wall, you're so far behind. And since Mexicans are now a limited resource and we're in a labor crunch now, you need to really consider whether or not your company is going to survive. And the American company that has doubled and tripled and quadrupled down on China despite all of the warnings to the contrary is Apple. So if you have an iPhone, I hope you like it. There's probably not going to be another one for several years. Third, food. That's about the only remaining pillar of support that the Chinese have since their health policy is now disintegrating around them. About 3 years ago, the Chinese got hit with something called African swine fever, which is like Ebola, but for pigs. They had to cull 2/3 of their herd, which means they killed more pigs commercially than the rest of the world has. They've got the world's largest herd, about 60% of the global total. Since then, they've started to rebuild their herd, but the people who are rebuilding are folks that came in for subsidies. The original pig farmers all went bankrupt and left the industry. So we've got 2 million pig farms in China, the majority of the production, that have no idea what they're doing. African swine fever is already coming back in. And so we're going to have another mass culling. If the Chinese lose pork, which is their most culturally significant food, there's only one significant food left for them, and that's rice. Rice is very hungry for phosphate fertilizer. China used to be the world's largest producer and exporter. They've now banned the exports of phosphate until further notice. Now, this all went down before the Ukraine war. So now we have a phosphate shortage and a nitrogen shortage and a potash shortage all at the same time. Building new facilities to produce more of this stuff takes 3 years minimum. The fertilizer problems we have legs. And in China, it means a large-scale separation from the rest of the world. Okay, we already talked about Taiwan, so we can skip that. Let's talk about green tech. Hey, guys, I'm going to take 30 seconds to grab some more water. I will be right back. My new migraine medication makes me think I'm always in Phoenix. It's dry. Okay. The circle in the middle is total energy use, doesn't matter what it is, solar, coal, whatever. If you go to the left, you peel out and you look what the carbon fuel section looks like. If you take that small wedge and you go to the right, you see what the non-carbon section looks like. And if you kind of zoom in on that one on the right, you can see how tiny, tiny, tiny wind and solar are. Nuclear and hydro are by far the biggest. Solar is only 9% of non-carbon and 1.5% of all energy. Just to give you an idea of how big of a lever we would need if we want to do something about this. Carbon fuels work because they are literally energy concentrated in physical form. Oil is so energy dense that we store it within our modes of transportation. The green tech stuff is either extraordinarily site specific or extraordinarily energy non-dense, or both. So if, for example, you wanted to make all of New York City run on solar, you would need a solar farm that is about the size of Ohio, because the sun does not do a lot of interesting things in upstate New York. It's just not a bright place. Okay. Next, let's talk about where it works. The red zones on this map are where solar is actually a pretty good idea. These are places where the seasonal variation is not too extreme. These are places where you get a lot of sun every day. You move from the red and the orange and the math starts to break down. It's not as bright. There's a lot more fog or dust, and you probably are still making a positive environmental contribution. But from an economic point of view, it's probably a wash compared to a fossil fuel system. So red's great, orange so-so. By the time you get to green, you will never generate enough electricity from your solar system to pay back the carbon debt that it took to build them in the first place. The first step of turning silicon into something useful is to put in a coal-powered blast furnace and burn away everything else. So the carbon footprint of making green tech, ironically, is really bad. So this is solar. Now, same concept for wind. Again, red good, green bad. I'm going to combine them now, just looking at the good places. Green, good for solar. Blue, good for wind. Dark green, good for both. You'll notice we've already eliminated about 90% of the Earth's surface. But we're not done. You now have to eliminate anything that is more than 1,000 miles from a population center. This is all that's left. So in the United States, in the Great Plains, wind is still good. In the Southwest, solar is still good. But everywhere else, yeah, I mean, we're talking like 7 countries can do this at scale. 7. One of them is not China, one of them is not India. There's also a cost issue, even assuming we can improve the technology. What we've got on the left is the total life cycle cost for a combined cycle natural gas plant, which is where the United States gets the single largest wedge of our power input. And it's about what you would expect. Only about 1/5 of the cost is from building the facility itself. That gray in the middle, that's the fuel. It's a subscription basis. You pay as you go. But that's not how it works for green tech. In green tech, almost all of it is up front, about 60%. Now, in a pre-2022 environment where the baby boomers are capital rich and we're the cheapest capital cost we've ever had in the world, prepaying your power bill for 20, 30 years, that makes a lot of sense. But in a post-2022 world where the baby boomers have retired and taken their money with them and the cost of financing goes through the roof, the model breaks down and it will become much, much more expensive, not less, to implement green tech at scale compared to carbon-based fuels. And this is just around the corner. This starts next year. And even if we can get the money, there's a problem with materials. This is material weights for power generation by material. At the top, the wind categories and solar, they require a lot of materials that we don't necessarily use in the ones that are at the bottom of the list, which are conventional fuel sources. Coal and natural gas, it's all about the fuel. You need a bunch of copper for the power system, but not anything compared to what you need for wind or solar. And the same logic holds true for electric vehicles versus conventional cars. Now, these are the 3 products where the Russians are either the world's largest or second largest provider of the raw material. One of the things that the green movement hasn't really internalized yet is that, yes, the supply chains for oil are kind of a bitch. We're familiar with them, but we don't like them because it means we need to deal with Iran and Iraq and Venezuela and Russia. But if we are serious about moving on from oil, we have to replace that one messy supply chain with 11 more. And we have to regularly deal with Mexico and Canada and Venezuela and Colombia and Peru and Chile and Argentina and Australia and Indonesia and Malaysia and Egypt and Congo and DRC and India and Kazakhstan and China and, oh yeah, still Russia. We can have a world in the United States, we're going to have a world that uses oil where the United States is okay without global supply chains. We've got the supplies here. But we cannot do the green transition without a fully globalized system. And we have to have Russia to make that work. There is no way that green tech in its current form, there's no way that electric vehicles in their current form can be part of any climate solution because we're just not going to have the materials to build the stuff in the first place. Now, this is less true in the Western Hemisphere than the East. And if you add in Australia and Southeast Asia, we can make a lot of progress towards this. But we still can only get about 80% of the way there. And 80% is not enough to make these things actually work. All right, so this is total year-on-year global emissions by region. The Europeans, of course, are where industrialization began. So if you start in 1800, it's all them, but it's slimmed down to the picture we have now. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is to show where everything comes from on the right side of the graphic. So that big green bar is China. The United States is part of the gray. So the Chinese passed the combined Anglo world in terms of total emissions roughly 10 years ago. And now China is the single largest country for emissions. Now, the point of this is not to make you depressed, although, you know, that's a reasonable concern. The point of this is to show where we are right now so you can understand who is industrialized at volume versus who is not. Because if you remove the technological access we have today, if you remove the energy flows we have today, something is going to change in all of these. People forget that natural gas and oil are our low carbon fuels. And if we move away from that, there's a local fuel that is available to most countries known as lignite coal or soft, ultra soft brown coal. This is already the Germans' #1 power source, and that was before the Ukraine war. Because in Germany, they may have spent 2 trillion euros in building out their solar and wind system, but Germany is not a sunny or a windy country. So as they shut down other systems, like say nuclear, this is what they had to go to. And this is the future of most of the world when it comes to keeping the lights on. So we are perfectly capable of deglobalizing and having global economic breakdown where the United States just goes its own way and still having far higher carbon emissions. In fact, that's the most likely outcome now.
Can I ask a question,
Yeah.
please?
Shoot.
I had posted this in the chat too, but we talked yesterday about the same, China being a major contributor to greenhouse gases. What does it mean for China's ability and desire to meet their climate change commitments if they don't continue to thrive? You talked about them failing within this decade, maybe this year. They've committed to 2060, I believe, to meet the Paris Accord agreements. Where are we there?
Yeah, I'm agreeing, so it kind of hurts me to say this, but the Paris Accord was a horrible deal. Everyone is able to self-enforce, self-define their goals, and collect the data themselves to determine whether they succeeded or not. So it was a lot of virtue signaling with not a lot of progress made on any real deal. And then for the Chinese, they literally just made it up, and I really don't think they have any intention. If you wanted to take a more positive spin on that, a lot of countries assumed that they would make their goals with technology that doesn't yet exist. So it's really difficult to judge what that would be. But I see absolutely zero chance that China will pull that off, except if we just have a complete deindustrialization, decivilizational collapse, which means that China is a geographic function, not a political entity. Sorry. All right, give you an idea of what's what. Everything in the light gray on the roughly the left half, that's liquid fuels. We use it for cars, we use it for transportation primarily. Everything in the white block on the right side, that's some sort of value-added product, whether it's asphalt for roads or industrial lubricants or petrochemicals. So roughly 3/5 of the total is liquid oil used for transport. Transport. That is by far the most important aspect of all things oil. We do not have a technology to replace that. So if we do move into a deglobalized world, anyone who cannot get the oil suddenly cannot move at scale. That is the future of our world. And that has to provide the baseline understanding when you're looking at a country's military capacity. Once you lose it, you do not get it back unless somebody decides to give it to you. The world before 1945, the advanced countries were industrial. The non-advanced countries were not industrial. And so there was a very us versus them mentality when it came to wars. Either you had the oil, and so you had an empire and colonies, or you did not, and you were a colony. We're going back there. Because oil is also required for industrial transport. And if you remove oil access at the same time you start factoring in some very, very mild climate change, you get a very different picture. Now, predicting climate change down to the city level is almost impossible, and I would argue that our math on that is absolutely awful. The best example I can offer is last summer when Portland became an easy bake oven at 120 degrees for several days. I mean, for a 2-week period, Portland, grungy, drizzly, cloudy Portland, became hotter than Las Vegas had ever been. There are plenty of predictions out there for the Houston becoming unlivable or Florida going underwater and deserts becoming bigger, but no one had predicted that the Pacific Northwest was going to be one of the early casualties of climate change. We're not that good. What we can do is look at the last century of weather data, not forecast data, hard data, and we can see trend lines. The biggest concern I've got is within those trend lines, there's a sign that wind patterns from the equator to the pole are becoming more extreme, largely because land heats more quickly than water, and the poles are heating more quickly than the equator as well, or the equatorial oceans. And that generates more wind going from the equator out. And so you have to look towards the equator to see what you will get. In the case of the United States, that means more tropical moisture coming in as storm systems. That may be coming as hurricanes. I'm not saying we're that good at the data, but we definitely know that we're getting more and more water in the Midwest, and that is allowing more and more farming. But if you move over to, say, the European and the Russian space, there's no tropical water south of them. And in fact, in the Russian wheat belt, there's desert between the wheat belt and the equator. So these areas are drying out. That suggests to me that we're going to have agricultural breakdowns in a lot of places, not just because of a problem with fertilizer, but because of a problem with climate. And it's hitting parts of the world harder. Now, in the United States, if you're a farmer, you're going to make mad money on this. But if you're saying the Russian wheat belt, no. I don't think the Russians are in danger of dropping back into subsistence farming anytime soon, but we can certainly kiss a lot of their exports goodbye. All right. This is just a couple of graphics I pulled from the new book that comes out in June. The dotted lines are what matters here. Dotted lines are when shale became the majority of American energy production, and you can see how radically it changed things. So on the top two, so on the left, you've got coal, and on the right, you've got natural gas. Once natural gas was competing with coal in a very big way, that's the top left, production just dropped off. Hard to compete with free. And on the right, you can see where all that natural gas radically increased production, the blue line, and how it started pulling away from total consumption, the orange line, and we started becoming the world's second largest exporter of natural gas, most notably pipes to Mexico, but also a significant amount of LNG. We even have a couple pipes up into Canada, of all places now. The bottom right, same idea, but with crude. The blue is what used to be imports. The orange is exports, and you can see that a few years ago, the lines crossed. Now, we did have a quick recombining during COVID briefly, but those have already widened back. I just don't have good enough data because the United States Department of Energy reports data differently from everyone else. We don't report crude oil production. We report refinery production, because in the eyes of the DOE, no one uses crude, people use refined product. I can see the logic, but nobody else does that. So it makes it an apples and oranges comparison, which is a real pain in the ass. And we have to wait for someone else to report American data in order to get something that's actually useful for comparison purposes. Bottom line, shale good. Canada good too. The Canadians started in roughly 1980 to crack the code on something we now know as tar sands, or the oil sands. That's the orange output. That's entirely from Alberta, with maybe a little bit from Saskatchewan. The blue is their more conventional crude. And as you can see, the orange is now as big as the blue. Now, the Canadians have probably peaked out. They have had the same issues going on in their oil patch that everywhere else in the world, where people are like, oh, oil bad. And so investment is kind of flatline. So that 5.5 number, million barrels per day, that's about where they've been now for the last year and a half. I don't expect it to get very big, any much bigger than that very soon. 3 to 8 years to bring a project online. That's just the world we're in. And they have nowhere to send it. You'll notice that all of the shale fields are between the Rockies and the Appalachians. And this is where Keystone was supposed to go. So the economic argument, especially in a world where the United States is restricting exports, the economic argument for Keystone is a little questionable, because they would be running a crude line into the most super saturated oil markets in the world in order to get it to Houston, where it could then be refined. So all of the value add is done in the United States, and American refineries will then be able to send that product wherever they want. But Albertan crude production has to compete with US crude prices. And whereas the break-even price for American shale is now sub 50, the break-even price for Albertan crude is above 70. And the economics for it don't make a huge amount of sense anymore. I think they missed their window on that, unfortunately. So it's going to be all US shale all the time for the US market. Love this graphic. Okay. There's a whole mess of things going on in here. First of all, the blue are fields or crude sources that I do not expect to be restricted in any meaningful way. And in the upper left-hand corner, the ones that have the slash through them, those are the US major shale projects. Overall, this is talking about crude quality. So if you're in the upper left, you're talking light crude, sweet crude, which is a way of saying it has almost no contaminants. And it's usually the coloring consistency of nail polish remover. It's very easy to refine. And historically speaking, that crude has sold at a significant premium to other crude grades. If you move to the bottom right, that's heavier crude, lots of contaminants, and usually that's the thick, gooey stuff that we normally think of when we think of crude oil. Here on the right, it has few contaminants, but it's still pretty thin. If you're on the bottom left, it doesn't have very many contaminants, but it's fairly thick. This matrix is how every refinery in the world has to plan. Most refineries can only run a very specific type of crude, sometimes from a specific oil field. The chemical composition of all the crudes is very different place to place. Now, with the world I anticipate, where we're going to have a lot more military confrontations in a lot more places, the Ukraine war is just the first of many. Anything in blue is fine. Anything in green is probably fine. But by the time you get to the oranges, and especially the reds, we should not count on that crude getting out in large volumes on a regular basis. Give you an idea of where we are, Urals is right now orange. We'll see if that holds, because I anticipate at some point the European coalition is probably going to break and allow some more Urals to get out, allowing the Russians to at least export half of what they've got. But this is the sort of thing that when I put this in front of a bunch of refinery, we really hope, sorry, when I put this words, when I put this chart in front of refiner operators, where they have to run their entire business plan on what type of crude they can get, they really have to schedule those events on the ground floor, because this will make some of them borderline suicidal. You're talking about billion-dollar investments they have made in order to run a very specific crude grade. And for half of them, what they have hoped for is simply going to go away. Now, you can retool your refineries to run a different grade, but then you're running that grade and you're just as vulnerable, but to a different input source. The bigger your system, the more crude grades you can access, the more you can blend two things to get something that's more approximate to what you need, the better you're going to be. The United States doesn't do a lot of that right now, but we're going to be getting into it in a very big way once we have that export ban, because then we're going to have a lot of light sweet in the neighborhood because of shale, and we're still going to have a fair amount of heavy sour because of the Canadians, and we're going to be able to muddle through, and we're going to be able to muddle through in an environment of a super saturated crude market. That'll keep prices more accessible. But if you move over into, say, East Asia, you're lucky to get whatever you can get. And you're going to have to run it through your refinery and do a lot of repairs, because it will trigger a lot of damage. And then you're going to have something called run loss, which is just what it sounds like. You can't get 100% of the crude to give you product. You're probably only going to get like 80 to 90%. And that's 10 to 20% of the total output that you have just burned into nothing and is wasted. And in a high price environment, that's just crippling. I have always seen three big wars coming as deglobalization kicks in. The Ukraine war is start of that one. The next one, shocker, involves the Middle East. Without the United States there saying what's what, we are going to have a fight between the Iranians and the Saudis over who's in charge. The Abqaiq facility is the largest single oil field on the planet and is responsible for half of Saudi output. Unfortunately for the Saudis, who are Sunni Arabs, Shia live in the vicinity of Abqaiq, as well as in the vicinity of all the offloading facilities to get things onto the tankers. Iran has a very similar problem. Their oil all comes from Khuzestan, and Khuzestan is the only province that they have that is not populated by Persians, but instead is populated by Arabs. So there are fifth columns in the millions living on top of all of the energy assets for both. And to think in a post-American world where these two are going at each other, that this is going to continue stably, I think is more hopeful than I am capable of being. There is one aspect to consider that is kind of funky. Right here, we've got the bypass pipelines, one from the UAE to the Gulf of Oman, and one from the fields in eastern Saudi Arabia to the offloading facilities in western Saudi Arabia on the Red Sea. Iran doesn't have a bypass pipeline. So when we do get to the point that there's a fight here, the Iranians have always said their entire game plan is we will close the straits. That's always been a threat at us. We have maintained the global order, and we have made sure we can get the oil out of the Persian Gulf to everyone as a understanding for the globalized system. You get to expand economically if we get to write the security policies, but we're not here anymore. And so if the Iranians try to shut the Gulf, the Saudis will help, because they can still get 5 million barrels a day out, but the Iranians can't. So we're now in a situation where both of the major powers believe they have a vested interest in shutting down oil trade. If you thought China was rough before, just wait till that happens. Here's a messy graphic. Very short version, the red bars, mostly in the east, those are the net oil importers. The green bars, mostly in the west, are the world's major oil exporters, and they are an inconveniently long 5,000 to 7,000 miles apart. This whole line, this is the route that most oil follows right now. Coming from the Persian Gulf, around the tip of the Indian subcontinent, going through the Strait of Malacca, and then on up to Northeast Asia. That's not going to be viable in a post-American military scenario. Remember, the Chinese have a lot of ships, but none of them have range, whereas the entire Japanese Navy has range. So in a war scenario, this is the route that Japan will use to get crude from the Persian Gulf, going outside of the range of most Chinese weapon systems. Now, there are two weapon systems that the Chinese have to consider. The first, let's see, yeah, there we go. You guys seeing that? So the YJ class, that is their fighter bomber. It's very limited range, not nearly as good as what is in the American allies of the same in the same area. This is the system that the Japanese are going to have to stay out of range of. Now, those ballistic missiles that the Chinese have considerably longer range. The problem that the Chinese have, let's shrink this back down there, is that the Chinese ballistic missile systems require eye on target. One of the reasons I don't overly worry about an American-China war is as soon as the carriers realize that someone is shooting, they move. And one of the first things we will do in any war scenario is shoot down all the Chinese satellites. So the Chinese probably have like, what, 8 hours if they're going to take out an American vessel, especially if a carrier. And after that, game's up. So in a post-American world where the Chinese can't really defend space, I fully expect the Japanese to be able to keep the lights on and keep the fuel flowing, but the Chinese not to. So one way or another, demographically, financially, politically, health, food, one way or another, we are living in China's final years right now. And it's not the sort of country that I really worry about being there in the long run. That makes these areas difficult zones to have any sort of meaningful shipping, because this is where the shooting's going to be. That's 3/4 of global agricultural, energy, and manufacturing shipments. That's a fundamental economic reworking of everything. And every single aspect of that benefits the American economy, because we are the only economy of size that can function in a world where globalized trade is no longer in existence. Everyone else, it's just a question of who they partner with to try to make it work. The United States is going to be the largest partner that everyone's going to want, but you don't get it for free. One of the fun things about the Trump administration is that he went to our 3 largest hosts of military forces, Germany, Korea, and Japan, and said, you need to pay more. In some cases, 10 times as much as what they were getting before, what they were paying before in order for American forces to stay. The Germans walked away from the table. And if it wasn't for the Ukraine war, it's entirely possible that the American-German relationship would already be over. The Koreans balked. And so we started withdrawing some forces from Korea. Biden hasn't undone that. Japan tipped us, paid everything that Trump wanted and more. The Japanese have decided that their future is hand in hand with the United States come hell and high water. And when it came time to put sanctions on the Russians for the Ukraine war, Japan, a country that was always tried to be neutral versus Russia, they were the 3rd country to sign on. They're with us now. Okay. Just to give you an idea of what global pricing looks like when it's not global anymore, and then we're going to go for whatever Q&A we got. So in the United States, $70 is the functional ceiling. Fun thing about American shale. Assuming you have all the inputs in place, it only takes about 8 weeks to bring a new well online. Now, right now in this inflationary environment that we're in, it takes longer, sometimes as long as 8 months. But it does mean that American production can react to pricing very, very quickly compared to, say, the Europeans. The North Sea is deep water. West Africa is deep water. Bringing new stuff on there online is a minimum of 4 years. So you get $100, $200, $300 oil, and the soonest you can hope any sort of shift is a half a decade. That's the environment the Europeans are in right now. That's one of the reasons why their natural gas prices are 6 times ours before we have a Russian interruption. And finally, the East Asians are the last men in the chain. They simply can't function because they are not in charge of any of the production zones, and they are not proximate to any of them. So it is now up to the East Asians to deal with the never-ending joy that is the Persian Gulf. Some of them do have some options. So for example, the Japanese with their Navy can go into the Western Hemisphere. They're our partners. They'll probably get a little bit of American crude. They'll probably get a little bit of Mexican crude. They'll probably get a little bit of Colombian crude, maybe some Brazilian crude. It's not as reliable as doing it yourself, but it's the next best thing. So you can see the Chinese having an energy-starved system with extraordinarily high energy prices and a complete inability to source it themselves, while the Japanese have a modified system that's still expensive, but is not so crippling. And that's the world we are going to be in within 3 years. What to say? These are the 3 books that are out right now. And for the time being and for the foreseeable future, all sales from all formats from all 3 books are going to the AFIA Foundation, which is providing medical support to the Ukrainian refugee community. Right now, we have 7 million refugees that have already left the country, another 7.5 million that are in country that are going to have to leave before long because they don't have any homes to go back to. And then the new boy, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, comes out in June. It was supposed to be out yesterday, but there's a paper shortage, so it got pushed back 5 weeks. Okay, that's a lot. I will take whatever questions you guys have for as long as I can take them. I don't think, I'm just looking at my calendar here real quick. I'm good for over an hour, so hopefully that's plenty of time. Okay, what do you got?
Well, I certainly have one if I can start, if you don't mind, Alex.
Go for it.
So I'm Jonathan Keene. I'm the resident Space Force nerd. So, so listen to your brief. A lot going on there. A lot of good information. If I had to condense all that down and provide like the 2-sentence gist, it basically boiled down to the world is hosed, the geopolitical order is going to crash, and we are in for massive disruptions in both energy, and there's going to be massive wars and population collapse in the next couple of decades. Yep. So obviously, as a national security strategist, in air quotes, if you will, that's a cause for concern. I mean, what thoughts do you see a way for the U.S. and our larger Western allies to navigate that and avoid that situation, or do you see it as inevitable?
I think the Ukraine war made it, well, let me back up. The last president that we had that wanted to prepare for a post-Cold War system that would not be a free-for-all was George Herbert Walker Bush. And he tried to get us to have a conversation about what sort of world we wanted to live in. And we voted him out of office for it. And then we elected Clinton, who was, let's just say, distracted, and W, who was distracted by a specific region, and Obama, who didn't like to talk to anyone, Trump, who liked to yell at everyone, and now Biden, who is the most economically nationalist president we have had since Hoover. We haven't started the conversation in this country about what we want. And until we do, it's difficult to come up with a military strategy because right now we don't have a goal to point the military at. You guys are still operating under the last set of strategic guidance that you got in 1989. It has not been updated since then. And everything out of our procurement and our weapons development system reflects that. Until such time that we have that conversation with ourselves, this is all unavoidable. You could even argue that we're so far advanced now in the demographic decay, and with the Ukraine war being kind of a hard stop of the globalized era, that we're now well past the point of no return. The American people find Ukraine interesting. They don't see it as a threat yet. They're just curious about it because it's the first time since 1989 that something has come across the foreign policy screen that is more than playing whack-a-mole with Islamic terrorists. And that's almost refreshing, I guess. If our goal is to hold up the civilizational ceiling in some meaningful way, that means some version of a return to de facto subsidizing the security of a large number of countries. The question is who makes the cut? And that again requires first that conversation about what it is we want. So The reason I'm so certain that Biden is going to end the oil export ban this year, I'm sorry, reinstate the export ban this year, is we haven't had that conversation. And so the very concept of economic after effects isn't even entering into policy at the moment. And while I'm glad that the Biden administration has engaged on the Ukraine war, I had my doubts. There is not even the start of the process of doing more. And if you look at what we're doing with Ukraine, there's no economic aspect whatsoever, especially as relates to the allies. So the Russians are going to have this challenge to the German system very soon, and the Americans are going to have a challenge to the energy system very soon. And we're going to have a very clear idea of what our trajectory is going to be by September. And I can't say I'm hopeful from a globalization point of view. From a military point of view, I would argue that the Ukraine war is going swimmingly. It's going to be a long time till we prevent the Russians from being able to be functional in a military scheme. But the fact that the Ukrainians have done what they've done with the weapons that they've had, and now they're getting some seriously heavy gear, I'm optimistic. So quiet.
I know.
If I may, sir,
Please.
I'm Colonel Ionel Vlasie from Romania. First of all, I want to thank you for your enlightening presentation. Although I have to admit, at least the first part was kind of disturbing. You know, Romania is
anyone who is not disturbed by the Russians going to war has not been paying attention.
So,
yes.
So considering that the European Union probably in the blueprint was mainly an economic and social project or experiment.
Certainly.
Never, maybe there was a whisper or a dream to become a political one. What's going on now in Europe? It seems that Russia invasion in Ukraine succeeded what the European failed, and the EU is about to become a successful story from the political stand. But the way you portrayed the situation with this energy crisis, is EU gonna survive as an economic, entity without having support from United States? Do you see a future for?
We're certainly in the witching hour. We're certainly in the time of testing. Europe's demographic decline is so advanced that it's well past the point of no return. That's as true in Germany as it is in Italy and Romania. The only way that the European Union can survive as an economic entity is if some version of globalized trade, specifically with access to the US market, continues. And it is not clear to me that that is going to happen. Again, the Biden administration is more nationalist and populist on economic issues than any other president we've had in the last century. And without access to global resources, it's difficult to imagine not just the Chinese system surviving in its current form, but also the European one. The proximate risk, of course, is what happens with Turkey and Germany in the very short term. So we will have a good feel for how much the Germans are willing to suffer in the name of European unity this summer. I don't know. This is Germany's first real decision since 1945. We have n equals 0. We have no idea what they're going to do when they're put under that kind of pressure. And then as for the question you didn't ask, in Romania, the Russians feel they need to reach the Danube Delta. So they need to cross the Prut. They don't need to conquer half the country like it probably will be for Poland. But you will definitely feel it, because that means you will lose access to Danube transport.
We have seen that bullet coming, sir. I'm not revealing any secret. All our plans are Taylor, on this.
I'm glad to hear you're worrying about the right
And
thing.
that's why we've been gearing up and, buying and trying to modernize and change our military capabilities in order to cope and handle that situation.
Yeah.
Thank you very
If
much
I
for
may
your-
be so bold, I think that once we get to that point, the question will be just how well Bulgaria and Romania get along with Turkey, because you will need Turkish forces to stop it.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hi, this is Mace Carpenter. Again, great briefing. I try to help with energy, and you've really knitted the social, the geopolitical economy with energy, and thanks. My question is, what are the steps that you see that the U.S. can take to help the climate, both internally and in the leadership role?
Sure. In my opinion, the green techs we have today are not sufficient to the task. And in most places, if they are applied at scale, it actually increases the problem. So my recommendation would be a massive series of grants to tertiary educational institutions to improve the material science of every aspect of the green revolution, whether that generation with solar and wind, and especially coming up with a much better and simpler battery chemistry that does not require the current supply chain system to work. Smart money is chasing these things, but it needs to be expanded by at least a factor of 100. And I would prefer to see most of the money that we're investing into rolling out a technology that we know doesn't work be applied to developing technologies that will work. Because if our goal is to really lower not just American carbon intensity, but global carbon intensity, we have to come up with a simple supply chain system, a simple manufacturing system that functions at low cost, so that other countries can apply these technologies as well. The United States is steadily decarbonizing, and we can continue to do that in a deglobalized system, but most of the rest of the world can't. So we need to come up with a system that is appropriate in other places. And we're unfortunately just not moving that direction very quickly at all.
Wow. Thank you.
Sure.
Good morning, Peter. It's Ruth Ann. How are you today?
Hey, Ruth Ann, how you doing?
Doing great. Hey, question for you on the nuclear front, and if you don't want to talk about that, I appreciate that.
Oh,
but most of the raw material nuclear chain right now comes out of Russia, and I understand that there are other places.
Russia, Kazakhstan, yeah.
Yes, that it can come out of. My question is, given the challenges that we have with the flow of crude right now, do you see countries like Germany possibly looking to reopen their nuclear? And then do you also see a potential supply chain that is not from that region? Over.
Sure. So the problem in Germany, of course, is that the Greens have staked their political existence on ending the nuclear program, and they see nuclear power fuels as a worse solution than soft coal. So that's an internal ideological disconnect that exists within the German system. I would expect once it becomes clear that a lot of this stuff is going to go off, a lot of the fossil fuel stuff is going to go offline in Europe anyway, that for them to bite the bullet and turn some of those things back on. So I think that's where we're going to end before the end of this year. For the broader question on supply chain, the problem is Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan produces more uranium than I think the next 5 countries put together. Australia and Canada are both in the top 3, and Australia is rapidly expanding output while Canadian output is crashing just because of the capacity of the mines are falling in Canada, whereas the Australians are expanding. So it's not that we don't have any uranium, we just don't have enough. In the midterm, while we're waiting for countries like especially Australia to expand output, if we want to continue with nuclear power fuel as part of the equation, we are going to have to, in this country, build out better reprocessing facilities to harvest the spent fuel and recycle some of it into new fuel. That will get us about 3/4 of the way that we need to go. The problem we have is that when the Cold War ended, we decided to spin down all of our uranium-based weapons into electricity generating civilian fuel. It was a great plan. It got rid of 20,000 weapons in Russia. We'd be in a much worse position from a strategic point of view today if we hadn't done that. But it did mean that for 15 years, American nuclear supply chain folks that were in the fuel side got put out of business. And now we import most of it. Now, those facilities are still there, but we're going to have a labor problem because it's been 20 years now since that started. But if we can bring those up online, if we can respin some of the spent nuclear fuel, we're going to be fine. But that would be the sort of thing that I would like to think we would have started 4 years ago when we, especially in 2008, when we got the sign of just how aggressive the Russians were going to be, but we have not. So we're starting from scratch like we are with so many things. So I expect instead that we will expand coal use in the midterm until we can bring nuke stuff back online, barring an act of Congress that mandates certain things. And with the shift from Obama to Trump to Biden, the country's political mood has turned more and more populist, and we might be getting to the point where there's a push in Congress for blatantly interventionist economic policy from the federal government, which would speed some of this up. Whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, of course, depends upon your view of everything from coal and nuclear to wind to the role of government in the economy. It's a thorny issue, but nothing focuses the mind quite like a blackout.
So to extend that conversation, and thank you, I appreciate that insight. And when you and I get together, we'll chat on that topic. Shale has been a boon for the United States.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, are there other places in the world, particularly that are going to be the most hard hit, that can also start their own shale revolution? And do you see the U.S. supporting its allies in actually creating shale economies in other geographic locations? Over.
The U.S. has a policy within the Department of Energy to poke at that a little bit, but they haven't had a lot of success because the geology isn't as good as it is in the United States. In the United States, just a quirk of geology, when our sedimentary beds formed during the age of the dinosaurs, it happened 4 or 5 times in most places, and in the Permian, it happened 11 times. So that's one of the reasons why when you drill into the Delaware Basin, you hit like 11 petroleum-bearing zones with one vertical shaft, and it's fantastic. The world's second and third largest shale sectors are Canada, primarily for natural gas, and Argentina, because they've got a similar geology and they already have infrastructure going to the fields, and their equivalent of the Permian is actually closer to Buenos Aires than the Permian is to, say, Dallas and Houston. So those two are actually doing pretty well. Everywhere else, it's totally on the back burner. A big problem is that there is not another country on the planet where the subsoil can belong to a private entity. And if the landowners on the surface are not getting a cut of anything, then of course they're going to oppose production on their land. That's certainly the problem that the Brits and the Poles had when they started poking at this about 10 years ago. And so we still don't have meaningful production. There's also the problem in that in other shale areas where they do overlap with population centers, they overlap a little bit too well. So we've got the Eagle Ford, which is just south of San Antonio, which makes San Antonio and Houston perfect for oil absorption. But in France, the best basin they have is literally under Paris, and the densest concentration is directly under the Louvre. So can you imagine having a frac set up next to that big pyramid? And it's not something they're willing to consider right now. Now, again,
Well, it goes with the architecture.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in California, we've put a oil well in a mall, and one is disguised as a synagogue. So it's possible, but you have to have a degree of public acceptance. And until we have blackouts, I don't think that's going to happen. Australia has some, but they don't have the water. There's some great shale in Russia, but it's in the Bazanov, and it's like 1,000 miles from any place where anyone would ever want to live. So it's just, we don't have it lined up. I think we're more likely to see shale developments in North Africa than we are in Europe. And North Africa has conventional they're going to burn through first. They'd have to import an entire cadre of staff to do otherwise, which means the only one that I expect to join the shale club with any speed or fervor is probably going to be Mexico. Because Texans think of Mexico as a neighbor. They don't even think of it as a foreign country. And so in exporting the staff necessary to Mexico to make it work, that's kind of a slam dunk. But that's not going to happen under this president. You'll have to have a liberalization of Mexican energy laws first. And as long as the United States can export refined product to Mexico, they're not going to have a blackout. But that's where it would be most likely.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the insight.
Sure.
I'll ask a question since it's been kind of quiet here. As we're moving from a policy perspective to investments in renewables, from your lecture, we understand that there are going to be obvious disruptions to the supply chain. So how can the U.S. government, what can we do from a policy perspective or an investment economic perspective to keep that push going forward? Or is this sort of doomed given where we may go with the supply chains?
It's not doomed. Silicon is easy to source. It's in quartz rocks everywhere. It's like the fourth most regular element in the crust. So that's not the problem. There are various things that go into that besides copper. And the Biden administration has used the Defense Industries Act to force the sourcing of more of that closer to home. I'm not sure that's quite the right tool for the job, but it's not a bad tool for the job. The problem is going to be the purification of the silicon in the first step. So it's a three-step process. Number one, you mine the ore, the quartz. Number two, you throw it into a foundry, kind of like a blast furnace for steel, where you just heat it until everything that is not silicon boils away. And that gives you something that's roughly 99% silicon. That's great for glass and industrial uses and silicones like fake boobs and kitchen equipment, but that's no good for solar. For that, you need 99.999999%. Now, that second stage, the US is very good at. We have exported the first stage to countries that don't give two shits about environmental issues like China and Russia. So we need to resource or reshore that first processing stage. Once that is done, we're better at the second stage than almost anybody else. We can fabricate the solar panels at a competitive price. And then we have a final stage, which is assembly. And because of all the wires, we do not yet have a process to automate that. So mining the quartz, no problem. First blast stage, technologically simple, but environmentally damaging. Second stage, we already do. Third stage, we already do with the manufacturer. Assembly is going to have to be someone else. I'm not certain that the Mexicans are cheap enough labor to do that at scale. We might need to find another partner. My personal preference would be Colombia. We already have a free trade deal with them. They already have excellent relationships with both the United States and with Mexico. And in terms of value add per labor price point, they're arguably one of the most efficient countries in the world. But we're talking here about building up a supply chain that does not currently exist in the Western Hemisphere for 2 of the 5 steps. If we start now and there's a lot of government push behind it, that's still a 2 to 3 year process.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Do we have any more questions from any of you online? Now is the opportunity.
So Peter, this is Ruth Ann again. I do want to go back. There's been military strategies, particularly in the Army, that are embracing the electric and hybrid vehicle. You gave a wonderful kind of overview on that. So if I just want to better understand that as we look to make technology investments, you are what you see out in the world is that unless we go fully electric around the world, that having electric tactical vehicles is not going to be beneficial potentially to the U.S. military. And so if that is the case, then there's you would recommend that we look to put our technology investment dollars in potentially other areas. Did I understand kind of where you were coming from on that?
If you're forcing me to make a forecast or a recommendation on that, I would broadly agree. I am all for the military playing with every technology that is out there. Because the military is not driven by normal business considerations, you can take risks that the corporate community just can't. And in many times it generates materials or processes that then become the norm across the world. If it wasn't for what the military needed to do with spy technologies and satellites, we would not have cellular communications right now. So I'm never going to say no. That said, an electric vehicle with today's technology with a lithium cobalt based battery simply doesn't charge fast enough, discharge fast enough, or hold enough charge to be useful in a military context unless you bring enough diesel to run massive local generators in order to charge it, which from my point of view is actually complicating and increasing your carbon footprint rather than shrinking it. So yes, with today's technology, it just doesn't work. If you change the technology, if we get better material science, I reserve the right to change my mind. Change the facts, I'm going to change my mind. That's just how this is going to work. Fuel cells, I think, show a little bit more promise because they can hold more and stored charge. They have a better energy density than a lithium battery. But everything is going to be determined by where you are. So for example, we now have the technology to do small modular nuclear reactors. The smaller ones can be transported on a flatbed semi. Shockingly small. You pair that in a deployment situation with an electric fleet, I'll change my mind because all of a sudden you have brought your fuel depot with you and it doesn't have a logistical tail. Now, there's obviously issues of defense and contamination should something go horribly wrong. And we all know that in ground operations, you plan for things going horribly wrong. But I don't think we're to the stage that, how should I say this? The Biden administration says, oh yeah, the nuclearization of the power system for the military, yeah, that's the path forward. But with today's EVs, that's the only way to make it work in a war scenario.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
All right, do we have any more questions? Everybody's kind of quiet today, but if not, thank you, Peter. This was absolutely fantastic. What you were really able to do, I think, for our energy seminar was really take everything that we've learned this semester and kind of tie it all together, in terms of the politics, the sector, the markets, and the socio-political environment, and how all of that, brings us to where we are today. And really enjoyed listening to your insights of what might be coming. And you gave us a lot of things to think about, things we should be looking at that maybe we hadn't thought about looking at before in terms of the Ukraine and Russia and China. So on behalf of the Energy Seminar, thank you so much for taking the time. Really, really appreciate it. This has been invaluable for us. So thank you so much.
No problem. I'm hoping you all found it useful. If you do have follow-up questions, if you can just kind of funnel them through Alex to me, and I'll either point you in the direction of other materials that I've got, or I'll record a quick supplementary video and fire it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Thank you.
Everybody take care.